something shifted in your relationship, and maybe it happened slowly, like so slowly that you almost didn't notice when it started. Or maybe there was a specific moment. Maybe you looked across the room at your partner and you felt something, but it was further away than it used to be. This doesn't mean that you're in crisis. It's not a disaster, but something that used to be there isn't anymore. You're trying to work out whether that's fixable or whether it's just what relationships become. My name's Rob McPhillips. I'm a relationship coach and founder of Unifiers. In this video, I want to give you a framework for what's actually happening. It's not generic advice, it's not tips, but a map of the mechanism, why it happens, how it develops, and what genuinely changes for people who find their way through it. So let's start with what people generally notice. So I'll name some experiences that I've heard, and I want you to notice, does one of these resonate and feel familiar to you? The first one is you're not unhappy enough to leave, but you're not happy enough to stop wondering if you should. There's a kind of flatness where the relationship is functioning, you're getting on, but something that used to be present isn't anymore. And you can't always point to when it changed. It just did. The second, you keep having the same argument, a different topic each time, but it's the same feeling underneath it, the same dynamic, the same outcome where nothing really changes. And both of you know it. The third is that you feel that you're living alongside each other rather than with each other. So the logistics get coordinated, the schedules work, the kids are looked after, the bills are being paid, you're functioning, but somewhere in the day-to-day of it all, the connection got lost. You're more like very familiar housemates than the couple that you used to be. The fourth is that one of you, and it's usually one more than the other, is doing most of the relational work, initiating the difficult conversations, trying to close the distance, keeping an eye on where things are headed. And quietly, that person's running out of energy. The fifth is you've tried things. Maybe you've taken a holiday together, maybe a difficult conversation that helped for a while, maybe some sessions with someone, and it helped, but only temporarily. And the underlying thing didn't shift. 3 weeks later or 3 months later, back essentially where you were. These aren't 5 different problems. They're 5 different symptoms of the same thing. And the reason advice hasn't fixed it, the reason that the difficult conversation helped for a month and then the old pattern came back, is that most relationship advice addresses the symptom, not what's driving it. What's actually happening underneath is that every person arrives in a relationship with what I call a blueprint. It's an implicit picture of what the relationship is supposed to be, what a good week feels like, how decisions get made, and whose needs come first when life gets really busy. What does love look like in practice day to day? What counts as enough? You didn't design your blueprint consciously. It's something that we absorb from everything that we watch growing up, from the relationship our parents had, or the one that you swore you'd never repeat, from the version of the future that you built, or you'd even met this person, from the relationship that you had before this one. Your partner arrived with their own blueprint, slightly different, maybe very different, but in the early years, it didn't seem to matter. The overlap was wide enough, and the energy of building something new together was exciting enough to cover the gaps. You're both essentially in the same dream. But then life got busy and louder than the dream. The job change, children, financial pressure, bereavement, house move, something that required both of you to lean on your defaults more heavily than before. And when that pressure comes, that's when the gap between 2 blueprints starts to show. So it can be 10, 15, 20 years in. The fragility was always there, but when pressure mounts up, that's when you start to see the cracks. And it's not a decision, it's not a conversation, it's just a creeping feeling that you're not quite building the same thing. When you imagine the future, the pictures don't exactly match. Here's what explains the recurring argument. Every argument that you keep having is the same two blueprints colliding, but on different surface topics. So the argument about the holiday isn't about the holiday. The argument about money isn't about money. The argument about how much time you spend with each other's families, not about the families. They're all the same argument. They're two very different pictures of what this was supposed to be, meeting on a new topic. So when you resolve the argument, when you reach a compromise or someone backs down, or you agree to try something different, you've resolved the surface topic. The blueprints haven't changed. So the next topic arrives, and the collision happens again. It feels like, been here before, because you have. This isn't a communication problem. Communication skills help make the collision less damaging, but they don't close the gap between the blueprints. The question that comes first, the one that usually doesn't get asked, is this: what did each of us actually think we were building here? Not what we want now. What did we assume, without saying it out loud, that we were already both signed up to? Most couples have never asked that question. I'm not going to walk you through a step-by-step process in this video, not because it doesn't exist, but because the right approach depends on where you actually are, and that can vary significantly. What I can give you is the direction. The couples who find their way back to each other, who end up in the relationship that both of them actually wanted, they do it in a specific order. And it's usually not the order that most people do by default. Most people start with communication, and they try to talk about it better, more carefully, more honestly. And I can understand why, because it's the most visible problem. The arguments, the silences, the hurtful things that get said and the things that don't get said. So you work on communication and it helps. But without something underneath it, you're making the collision smoother, not closing the gap that's causing it. The layer beneath communication is connection, not the feeling of being in love. That's an outcome that will cause. I mean, the sense of being genuinely known by the other person, of being seen, not performed for, not managed, actually seen. When that's present, communication is dramatically easier. Not because you're trying to get through to someone who feels like a stranger. You're talking to someone who already knows you. But underneath connection, there's a layer that most couples skip entirely, and that's clarity. Not clarity about feelings, clarity about blueprints. What does each person actually need inside this relationship? What are they building toward? What matters to them in a way that isn't negotiable? What do they need the other person to understand about how they work under pressure? When there's no clarity at this level, connection is fragile because you don't quite know who you're connecting with. And communication is exhausting because you're always negotiating from different maps. So the direction is this: clarity, then connection, and then communication. They're not as 3 stages that you complete once and you move on from, but there is 3 things that you keep returning to, but in that order, each time when you hit a new ceiling. What that looks like in practice, the specific work, the actual conversations, depends on where you are right now. And that's what the assessment is designed to tell you. Let's be honest about what better actually looks like. Not the Hollywood version, the Disney version, or the version that gets sold. You're not going to become a new couple. The blueprint collision doesn't disappear. Pressure doesn't stop arriving. The recurring dynamic will never vanish entirely. What changes is both of you can see the gap clearly enough to talk about it directly rather than through the surface topics. So you stop arguing about the holiday and start talking about what the holiday was actually a proxy for. See, that's a much more direct and shorter conversation, less damaging, and it's more honest. And so the connection ceiling rises, not because everything's resolved, but because both people feel sufficiently known that the unresolved things don't feel like threats. You can hold disagreement without it automatically becoming distance. And perhaps the most important shift, the relationship stops being something that's happening to you. It becomes something that you're building consciously, from blueprints that you've actually chosen rather than ones that you inherited without knowing it. This for me is what I mean by freedom is the prize. Most people carry an assumption that's usually unexamined that I'm going to be in a committed relationship. I'm going to have to be smaller. I'm going to have to compromise myself into a shape that fits the other person. The couples who do this work discover the opposite. A relationship with real clarity, real connection, and real communication creates more room for both people to become who they actually are, not less. That's the prognosis for people who do the work. And the work starts with knowing where you are. Below this video is the Relationship Vitals Assessment. There's 15 questions across the 3 areas that we just talked about: clarity, connection, and communication. It takes less than 3 minutes for most people. Your results will show you your overall position and which of the 3 areas is most depleted right now. That tells you specifically what needs attention first and what the right next step is for where you actually are. If you're thinking of doing this with your partner, make sure that you complete it separately before you compare results, because the gap between your scores is often the most revealing thing that it shows you. The link is just below. Take it from where you actually are and not where you want to be. That's the only way that it tells you something useful.